Okay, good morning, everyone. And we are now going ahead with today's session. Before we begin, we'll take a quick tour around the Connect meeting room on the screen in front of you. Please note that we have now turned on the recording function for archiving and playback through the CIDR website at cider.athabascau.ca. You are now being recorded. Beginning in the top right, you'll find a list of participants. We have a very small crowd here today, but we will be hopefully reaching our audience through the recording. Note in particular my name, Daniel Wilton, under Hosts. If you hover your mouse over my name, you'll see a pop-up allowing you to send me a private chat message. If you run into any technical issues during the presentation, feel free to send me a private message and I'll try to help you out without interrupting the flow of the presentation. Below the participant list is the chat area. Note that the chat is public and is recorded. It will be included in the archived version of the presentation. Here you can post comments and responses to some of the more informal questions that might come up during the talk. It's also an opportunity for the microphone shy to post questions in the Q&A after the presentation. The main window is, of course, the projection screen for the slides, and above that you'll find a button showing a little person with a raised hand. That is a pull-down menu with options for making this session a bit more interactive. You can give a smiley, applause. If you have a question for our speaker, please raise your hand and we can see you. After the presentation, I'll release the microphone and open things up for a Q&A. A new button will appear next to the little man, and you can grab the mic, walkie-talkie style, to ask your questions. And here we go. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us online for our season finale of CIDR sessions for 2012-2013. Appropriately for a session on the social dimension of distance education, we close out the season with not just one guest presenter, but a community of 4 inquirers. Dr. Karen Swan is the Stuckel Professor of Educational Leadership at the University of Illinois in Springfield and a faculty associate in the Center for Online Learning. Dr. Swan is a prolific researcher and author, having published over 100 articles and book chapters with a research focus on learning effectiveness and interactivity. Among other important roles within the American online education community, she has served as principal investigator for several large-scale projects at the state and federal levels, helped develop one of the first fully online master's degrees at the University of Albany, and as the past chair of the Sloan C International Conference on Online Learning, she was recently inducted into the originating class of Sloan C Fellows. Dr. Jennifer Richardson is Associate Professor of Learning Design and Technology in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. Dr. Richardson's research focuses on the social aspects of online learning and engaging learning in online environments, and she is co-director of a project into increasing access to quality learning through the effective use of peer feedback in online discussions for the U.S. Department of Education. Dr. Patrick Lowenthal is instructional designer at Boise State University in Boise, Idaho, and an adjunct instructor for the School of Education and Human Development at the University of Colorado in Denver. Dr. Lowenthal's research focuses on instructional communication, social presence, and technology's part in supporting or inhibiting that presence. In his previous life, he studied presence of a different sort, with a master's in the academic study of religion. And finally, we have one of our home team, Dr. Marty Cleveland Innes, professor and chair at the Center for Distance Education at Athabasca University, and currently an invited guest professor and researcher at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, Sweden. Dr. Cleveland Innes rounded out our 2011-12 season as well, and will be familiar to most of us here. What you may not know is that she is very involved in her mixed choir and the study of voice development and musicology, which I can imagine also involves a very subtle appreciation for the social presence of others. All 4 will be joining us and taking the stage in turns. If you didn't catch all the names, they will be introducing themselves as they go. Together, they hope to form a debate, or at least a discussion of ideas, between the work of Dr. Lowenthal and his colleagues and the work of Dr. Swan, Richardson, and Cleveland Innes, the women of social presence. I am now passing the microphone to our panel, beginning in Springfield with Dr. Swan. Note that today's slides are posted on our site at cider.athabascau.ca. The full recording of this session will be available at the site in about 2 hours. As a final note, remember that we now have a call-out for presenters for our 2013-2014 season. If you or someone you know have recent research in distance or online education and would like to present to our CIDR audience, please contact Dr. Terry Anderson. I'll put his email address in the chat. Okay, feel free to use your applause buttons here. Everyone, welcome our panel.
I'm not sure you can hear me, can you? Applause or some, good. I think I'm okay. My name is Karen Swan. I'm at the University of Illinois in Springfield, and I'm going to talk about a historical perspective on online learning. I thought I had a cartoon here, but I don't. So I'm just going to go to the slides. And starting with this slide about teacher immediacy, because that's the place where the notion of social presence really has its birth. Teacher immediacy was a lot of research was done on it. Started in the 1960s, and teacher immediacy is defined as the psychological distance between communicators, and in particular this research looked at the psychological distance between students and teachers, and found in a variety of studies and using a variety of models that the less of the psychological distance between communicators, the greater the learning. In terms of what's important for the notion of social presence is that researchers in this area characterized ways of reducing the distance in terms of both verbal behaviors, such as the use of humor and self-deprecation, and nonverbal behaviors, such as eye contact, smiling, physical proximity. So communication researchers, looking at communication in online discussion forums, came up with this notion of social presence as the quality of a medium to project the salience of others, because they thought that the low bandwidth made it impossible for people to communicate the kinds of nonverbal and some verbal, like intonation and voice, aspects of speech, and so you would not be able to communicate the same amount of immediacy, and so people would not learn as much. However, people who were actually working in the field of computer-mediated communication were finding that that students perceived the communication they were having as what Walther called hyperpersonal, that they really felt like they knew the other participants in their classes. And so people started researching this, and these people, mostly educators, took the term social presence and appropriated it to mean the perception of interpersonal connections with virtual others based entirely on verbal immediacy. So the kinds of definitions of social presence that came up in this venue are these. Gunawardena defines social presence as the degree to which a person is perceived as real in mediated communication. Tu defined it as the sense of community that a learner experiences in an online environment. Probably the most commonly used definition is that comes from the community of inquiry framework, and this is the ability of learners to project themselves socially and emotionally in a community of inquiry. And notice that project, because this research initially started as content analysis. So they were looking at verbal immediacy as it was played out in online discussion. Picciano defined social presence as a student's sense of being and belonging in a course. And Biocha, Harms, and Burgeon defined it as a sense of being with another in a virtual environment. I think you can see that all of these definitions are getting at pretty much the same thing. But researchers diverge when it comes to operationalizing the content. That is, what does social presence look like and how can it be measured? So the last thing I'm going to talk about here are those kinds of issues. One dimension is the one of defining social presence, is how to operationalize and measure it. And here we see that initial historical difference between individual perceptions of social presence and media course characteristics. But this is not necessarily an individual versus a versus. It's not a dichotomy necessarily. Think of all of these as dimensions and continuum. So where some researchers ask students to rate courses as a whole on social presence elements, others ask them to rate different technologies used in a course or different course designs, which is what 2 has been doing. Another dimension has to do with whether or not student perceptions or student behaviors are used to measure social presence. And this is that issue we talked about before with the initial community of inquiry research, which was content analysis, versus what Gunawardena and Jennifer Richardson, who's on this call, initially did using surveys. Another issue that is definitional, involves what elements are seen as making up social presence. Even within the community of inquiry, this is an issue with some researchers seeing social presence of value only in so much as it serves to move inquiry forward, whereas others, such as myself, see the development of feelings of community as important in and of themselves. Another issue that sort of derives from this is whether or not you see the elements of social presence as a taxonomy, as a hierarchical thing leading to cognition, or whether you see it as a set of behaviors. Finally, still another issue has to do with whose social presence we're talking about. The social presence of teachers is clearly different from the social presence of students, and each have differing effects. And so depending on whether or not you lump all social presence together or look at different the social presence of teachers or students, or even within the group of students, social presence is perceived differently by different people. So this is another issue that I think we have to address. As we move forward, maybe some of those people who are here, oh my gosh, look at that. There's as many participants as presenters, finally. If you participants and even some of you presenters could write in the chat what your definitions of social presence are, maybe that's something that we could talk about. And I'm going to pass it on.
Hi everybody, it's Jennifer Richardson. So while you're typing that, Karen can look it over and we can come back to what you think social presence too. I think that that's going to be a big part of the conversation. I'm kind of picking up right where she leaves off. I'm going to talk about what we know, what the research has shown us about social presence. And this first slide's a little overwhelming. You look at that and don't worry, I'm not going to go over each of these studies. The purpose of this table is just kind of to give you an idea. Karen was talking about all the people who have different perspectives and lenses for where they come at, the direction they come at for social presence. This is just a sampling of a lot of the instruments that we've seen that are in the research. We've got Gunawardena, who had 17 bipolar scales for the social presence survey. I know TWO's done a couple of different surveys, entirely different instruments. So not only are we defining it differently, but the point here is that we're measuring it differently. And I don't think that that's uncommon. I'll talk about it at the end for a lot of different constructs that we look at in research. There's just a lot of subjectivity that we're allowed to bring to these types of environments, research environments. Okay, so what do we actually know? This is a good bullet point list of things we definitely know. They've been shown over and over again. Verbal immediacy behaviors can lessen the psychological distance between communicators. I think that one's been well established. It was one of the first things Karen talked about, and that has really been looked at in the research starting in the 90s. We do know that student perception of social presence, how they see social presence, really does relate to satisfaction, and it does relate to their actual success in online courses. So perceived and real learning in online courses. And these are big things for us if we're to think of ourselves as being in the market of providing education for online environments. The student really doesn't matter, and we need to keep that focus. Let's see. Online text-based environments can be suitable for supporting complex learning, but we have to take into account social presence. There's a lot of research out there that looks at a particular technique this way or a particular method that way, or type of activity that will integrate social presence. And I know that Patrick's going to talk a little bit more about what some of those are. One thing, and this one's always interesting because people feel one way or the other about this, but the research has shown that learning is related to the quantity and quality of postings and online discussions, and if value is placed on them. Even among the faculty here that I teach with at Purdue, there's still kind of a split. Do I get involved in the discussions? Do I just let the discussions go? Do I give points for the discussions? Do I not? I think that, I know that I do, and Karen does, and I don't know about the rest of our panel, but we definitely think that you have to place value on these types of things. And it's not just a matter of making the assignments count, but making people participate and get involved in that social presence of that activity. And this last one, I mean, we talk about it a lot. We talk about, okay, students working in groups, that's really great. It's a way to help build that social presence again. It's one of the things that we look at the least in the research. We know that groups can increase student social presence, which we know has a positive impact. But a lot of times we don't think about what that really looks like or how to do it in an online course in such a way that it's actually effective. I know our students here in our online program hate group activities and things like that, but maybe we just need to work on those a little bit more. Love to hear what everybody else has to say about that too. Okay, so moving beyond the research of the participants, that's pretty much what we focused on so far. The last 5 years or so, we've seen a lot of social presence research that's looking at different types of environments or different aspects of the environment. One of the biggest, and it's been for over a decade, is the community of inquiry model, which Karen also mentioned. And obviously, you've got a lot of proponents in this group that work with this framework, this model. I just want to mention that this is like, what's really important about this is that social presence is part of a larger framework. We're no longer just looking at social presence by itself all the time, and it gives it a bigger picture, and it helps us to plan better for what these environments will look like. Okay. One example, and if you go to the COI website, which Marty's going to talk about at the end, this is just one of 100 studies out there on community of inquiry. This one actually looks specifically at social presence. Well, these two. Peter Shea and Marty's study here from 2010 tells us that social presence is very important. We know this, but especially in the development of cognitive presence, so in helping the students learn, whether it's helping them scaffold their learning, they're learning from peers, learning from direct instruction, but it's also dependent on teaching presence. So it's just how those are intertwined and giving us a better picture of what to expect. We also know from these types of things that for our practice, it means that we have to set up in advance for design social presence in a course, and we have to follow through throughout the course. Just a quick look at a couple of other studies. We've been looking at social presence in a number of other venues, like retention at the university level. And I think that this was a really good study because it tells us, they did the community of inquiry model, but they told us that 20% of the variability of the students in this study could be accounted for by social presence. So social presence was the make or break item for 20% of these people that were in the study about whether they were going to stay in their courses or leave. I mean, that's a big deal. Losing 20% of your population because you don't do it right or you don't do it well, something we really need to think about. Some other things that we need to think about, and I live in my own little social science world, right? I'm in the College of Education. I hang out with educators. There are differences across subject areas. And that's not necessarily big because people's personality traits are different so much as we need to consider how people are trained in their professions and how they teach and how that cycle continues on. So things that we find very important might not be as important to people in different areas. I think there's a lot more research that could go on there. Marty can answer all the questions you have about that one. All right, and just a couple of last things here. We're seeing, and this is just a sample, I mean, there's a ton of studies out there that are looking at social presence and how we can increase it using specific technologies. So we're calling this, emerging technologies for the explicit purpose of increasing your social presence. Phil Ice is kind of the king of audio feedback, and that's one of the things that he incorporated into a number of courses, and I know other people have done that as well. Students really like that. They respond positively to it. Other people are taking a different tack and they're adding or using entirely different type of classroom. We've got some virtual reality. We've got people that use Google Hangouts in addition to their classes, or it really depends on what your college already offers in terms of tools and what you can add on to it. We've got some here that sometimes go well and sometimes don't. One was a Mixable, which is a big tool here at Purdue, and it's kind of like a Facebook for education. And some students really liked it. Some students weren't sure it belonged in the class. So, got to keep on seeing how these things incorporate and can help us increase that social presence and satisfaction. Okay, so these are pretty much where we're going. I'm kind of picking up right where Karen left off. Still got many definitions. Related to those definitions, we've got a lot of measures and constructs. We can't just do our research in a vacuum. We need to look where we've been. We need to look what we've already found, and we need to move forward. And then a question to consider when you're describing or defining your social presence from earlier is it different? Is social presence entirely an anomaly because it has so many different lenses that people look at? I don't think so. But what can we gain from that when we have so many different ways to consider it? What can we make work for us? How can we leverage it? Okay, I'm going to pass this on. I'm going to disconnect my audio.
Hello everyone, hopefully you can hear me. I'm excited to be here with the Women of Social Presence. To me it's, I'm always interested in, social presence in action. It's what does it look like, when I talk to someone, how do I help them do it? It's, so to me it always comes back to practice, and hopefully then practice informs research and vice versa. But to me, it's like I started becoming obsessed with social presence. And it's funny, Dan's comment about my earlier life when I was studying religion, that's when I started getting obsessed with storytelling, which it all kind of comes together for me. But when I started teaching online, I was so afraid that so many of the things that I did that I thought worked so well face-to-face, whether immediacy, humor, present storytelling, the list goes on, right? I was terrified that it wouldn't translate to an online environment. And right when I started teaching online, I had been an online student, this is about 13 years ago, and I was afraid that I was going to find myself teaching online with this empty classroom, and that it just wasn't going to work, right? And this isn't that strange. I mean, I regularly talk to people who, and you can see the sound bites on, every paper around, the Chronicle, it's always there, right? When you work with other faculty and you tell them, or at least I tell them what I do, I help design online courses, I teach online, I often hear people say, well, that just can't be done. Because what I do, you have to be face-to-face, right? And so this is an overwhelming notion that still persists, despite the growth that we can give all the numbers, we can talk about all the studies, there is still this deep down fear of faculty and fear of students that they need other people, right? That they need to be looking face to face, if you will. So this obsession with mine of social presence, and for me, it's kind of to go back to like Karen talked about how people look at it and, well, how can it help learning? How can it help a learning community? To me, it's the whole continuum I'm interested in. I'm interested in just how people connect and establish themselves real through computer media communication, texting, you name it, outside of learning environments, but also how that comes in. And so Joni Dunlop, a colleague, friend, my PhD advisor, we started just sharing our obsession with social presence years ago, and we started just exploring, well, what are different ways to do it? You know, and so Jennifer kind of started talking about different ways that people are doing it. Jared's with us. He's done things with video feedback. I mean, there's lots of different ways. Well, Joni and I just started playing with lots of ways, and we've written about some of the things we've done over the years. We started using digital music, you know, having people tell throughout the course, like in the middle of the course, pick a song that's important, tell a story about why it's important. And the idea being that just those getting to know you activities shouldn't just take place at the beginning of the course, but usually have to be done throughout a course. And we later started using digital storytelling. You know, what are ways that students can create? We'd have them create digital stories, post them and share, and get feedback that way. Doing different things with VoiceThread. There's all kinds of different activities we've done with that. And we even for a while started using Twitter and trying to get that out of the classroom chit-chat, you know, as well as enculturating our students to the larger community of practice. Once again, we're just trying to build on this because we found that in a lot of ways learning management systems were constraining. And then we even did some basic things, and Joni still does this religiously, is pick up the phone. She does a 5-minute phone call with students at the beginning of every course. And so our obsession with social presence was thinking through what are, you know, some teaching presence, if you will, strategies we could do through facilitation, through instructional design to help establish social presence, as well as what are some things that we already know about social presence and people's behaviors. For instance, a phone's very comfortable, and we start getting into all of these elements of, you know, is it one-to-one communication that's important? Is it this group element? We later did a study where we listed all of the different things we did and sought our students' feedback because, for instance, Twitter was eating up all of our time, and we were wondering, you know, is this really make sense? And so one of the things that came out about that study actually was one of the most powerful things were feedback. And that's something that probably Jared can talk more about, some things he's done. I've done a lot with video feedback in courses I've done, audio-video feedback. But another was group work, and this is to bring it back to something Jen said, is that one of the things we found was successful group work, right, was one of the biggest things to help students establish presence with each other. And that was even more powerful when they've taken multiple courses with the person. And so my obsession was, how do I do this? How do I, if I had to talk to another faculty and say, this is the one thing to do, what is that one thing, right? If we go back to the coding, the discussions, you know, is, for instance, is just using someone's first name really all they need to do? Is it, you know, that greeting salutation enough, or are there other things? And are there things we as instructors and instructional designers can do? So in the chat pod, I want to take a couple of minutes and just think of, you know, what do you guys do to intentionally establish presence in the courses you teach? And if you don't teach courses, you've worked with others. And so it's more thinking between student to student, what do you do? What's one thing? You know, if you, back to this question, if you had to tell a colleague, this is the one thing, and I've done research too on subject matter differences, because I do believe that there are some differences across, and it's from working with faculty who, you know, the psych class that has 150 people, even though it's a social science area, it's kind of different than the courses I teach versus the computer science versus. With all that said, please share in the chat pod. We're going to take a minute. Name one thing that you do to establish social presence. And I don't see any chatting going on here. So I'm okay with some wait time. I'm going to wait it up. Here we go. I'm waiting for the multiple attendees are typing. Nice. and as you're doing it, it makes me think of other things I want to research with presence. It's the idea of silence, the idea of wait time, those types of things. So Jared does asynchronous video discussion boards for learner-learner interaction. This is something that, right, I can remember talking with Jared about this at PIDT a few years ago, and the technology, in some ways, we're so lucky that we can do things that a few years ago were so difficult. Jennifer, this is a comment that actually, this is something I want to research. Say I want to research all these things, but what I like about what Jen points out is something that didn't work, and I think that's key because I think so often we talk about like what does work. But she talks about she created a course, a video for a course, but she wasn't actually the teacher. So like in our program, for instance, we have a series of courses that teach people how to design websites, Dreamweaver, and I've done the newest series of videos, but students also use videos like lynda.com. And so is something lost, and do they feel quote-unquote cheated or presence diminished when the person doing the videos isn't their instructor? And I think that's a real key. Marty brings up rules of interaction, right? I mean, I think we get caught up in this idea that, oh, digital natives, or, well, we have all these silly little terms we like to use. And believe me, I've used them too. And we assume that people know how to do this stuff. And I did a Pachakacha a while ago where I basically argued that I want my daughter to have a class on email 101 rather than cursive writing. And the idea is that this computer-mediated discourse is a literacy that students have to develop, and they're not always good at. So I think rules of interaction, both in when and how, all of that I think is really key, is that structure can help. All right, so then student video intros. Yeah, I think that can be very key, right? And so that's kind of what, when we used digital stories, one way we did it was when a cohort, wasn't really a cohort, students had 2 back-to-back courses together, and they had a winter break between, and they did a digital story where they had to share something about their break. Icebreakers, course bios, definitely. Personal stories. See, this is, and this goes back to my love for storytelling. I think stories are key, and I think that self-disclosure is a key part in it. And we've done that some with music, but I think it's how do we intentionally design instances where students have to leverage their prior knowledge and make these things personal with a personal point of view. Group contracts, I think that's key, because back to when I said that we found that group work was successful, it was only when it was a good group experience. It's kind of like looping in the K-12 classroom. It's wonderful when you have a good teacher. What about when you don't? Or, and so what's ways that you can add structure to make that work? All right, more casual language. All right, we have some great stuff. So I'm going to keep going, but because I'm going to get into this instructor thing that we're already kind of getting into. And ultimately, we would love to just talk more and have you not just listen to me, but keep the back channel going. So this is the other element that kind of it was brought up, I think, by both Karen and Jen, but it's this idea that, especially where I'm going to use one of the key words these days, MOOCs, right? So with MOOCs, part of the question is, well, who is this kind of teacher behind the scenes, and is there a teacher, and what does it look like? For me, one of the things I found working with faculty is when this idea they get wrapped up in constructivism or this idea that they have to be a guide on the side, but what that sometimes plays out to is they just disappear. And I believe in, Chickering said there's lots of research that says that key learning experiences center might not be the right word, involve a teacher of some sort. And especially with formal online education experience, an instructor is a key component. This doesn't mean it needs to be instructor-centered, not at all. But I think it's reminding something, especially when we think about where's the future of the university, is I believe that one of the things that we can do, that we add value, right, that, say, Khan Academy doesn't, is that instructor who can relate, can do that interpersonal stuff, who can give feedback and do these things. And so to me, I think it's key thinking about how does the instructor establish their own presence there as a person? So not just teaching presence, but teacher or instructor social presence. And how do they do that without dominating and taking over where it becomes this very teacher-centered? So Jared posted some of his work. So he's done a few studies. And And I wanted more for him just to share his work, because I think sometimes we get caught up in our own circles where we don't always see what other people are doing. And I think his work's very important. And I think it gets on this idea of instructor social presence. One of the things that I regularly get key feedback from my students is I give audio video feedback, and it blows them away hearing my voice talking through it's been very important in my own teaching. So this is to continue the conversation that's already started. We've kind of touched this, but basically, do you strive to establish your own social presence? If so, how do you do it, right? So when I talk to, even if you work with faculty and ask them, and they're threaded discussions, which traditionally are like the bread and butter, right, of our typical college online course, ask them, do they participate or not? And they're all over the board, right? Some don't participate at all. Some, like my wife does this thing, she always sums up the week, right? So, but she doesn't get heavily involved. And of course, depends on the subject, depends on the content, list goes on. But what are some things, and how do you do it, right? I mean, how do you establish your presence as an instructor without being, right? You don't want it to seem so, this is all about me, but it's this tightrope, this like fine line that we find ourselves in. So I'm going to take a minute to try to catch up on the chat, and then I'm going to turn it over to Marty to close us up. All right, I think we're pretty much, I mean, we talked about the instructor role, and I want you, because one of the things that, one of the studies I'm trying to start with a colleague is on analyzing social presence in MOOCs, because to me it's this idea of what value added do we really add in this world where there's Code Academy and there's YouTube and there's Khan Academy. I think lots of value, but I think part of it too is letting people know that we are experts. We do eat, sleep, and breathe this stuff, and we care about other people, and we care about our students' success. So I think these are all part of it. So I'm going to turn it over because I think we can take this conversation a lot of ways. I just wanted to get everyone thinking about, what does it look like? How do we help others do this? And what works, what doesn't? And, and I think that I would love to almost have a conversation on what Jen said is, what doesn't work? So with that, because I think that's fabulous too. But I'm going to turn over the mic.
Hi everyone, can you hear me okay? Thank you. I'm so struck listening to this conversation by the fact that when I started graduate school, which was many years ago now, there was a policy of decorum for faculty members, which included that they not fraternize with graduate students. They were the faculty in my unit were not allowed to spend social time with students, and I thought that was very interesting at the time. And I did, in fact, for my first graduate degree, study how academic and social interaction affected attrition. And then went on when I did my doctoral studies to look at how social and academic interaction in university settings affected differences in outcomes, measuring deep and surface learning. And in both of my studies, and I built on them continuously as I've continued my career in both of my studies, all interaction was important. However, the topic, the characteristics of the student, whether the content was social or academic, etc., had a tremendous effect. So I think that we're, at base, what we're talking about here is the human experience of being engaged with one another in learning environments. And now we have this wonderful opportunity to look how that all plays out through the internet. How is it that this social and academic engagement, I've gone beyond the notion of just interaction, of course, to engagement, and how is it that that affects our experience? I'm honored to be called one of the women of social presence with Karen and Jennifer, who are really the true women of social presence. They've been looking at this concept in online environments even before the community of inquiry model emerged. Jennifer mentioned that the community of inquiry has enveloped these notions of social presence in some ways, and the focus has been there. She said there were, I think, 100 studies, and so I wanted to tell all of you that in fact there have been over 1,000 studies. And some of those studies are focused on social presence, some on all the other presences and what they're like combined. The point that I want to leave you with is that this is a very complex topic, social presence and beyond, and that we still have a lot of work to do. We've come a long way, but there's a lot to do, and there are some other things that we need to look at relative to social presence. So I just want to highlight a couple of things that I think are going to be of importance as we move on. Randy and I looked in 2005 at the relationship between social presence and cognitive presence and how that impacted deep and surface learning. And it was very clear that while social presence did play a role in the establishment of community, the interaction was a foundation and a base, but was clearly not enough. And in those 1,000 studies, in our earlier evaluation of those studies, and I just recently got a grant to do a meta-analysis on those 1,000 studies, but our initial pass-through shows us that we aren't studying enough of that relationship between cognitive and social presence. I know, Patrick, you're going to tell me there are some studies coming forward and that you're doing some, and I think that will be a direction for the future. Randy and another one of his students, Zara Akul, are also looking at metacognition, social presence, and the community of inquiry. Let me go back to the slide. So where we landed after this particular study that we did and looking at others was that social presence is necessary, but not a sufficient condition for learning. And while on the one hand we still have a lot of resistance in traditional higher ed to even engage socially with students and in the classroom, on the other hand we have a large movement suggesting that if you don't attend a lot to social presence in an online environment, you won't get the outcomes. And in fact, we haven't determined yet where the boundary is, how much social presence is enough for which students under and which topics and so on. So that kind of quantification will be helpful. It would be great for me and others to be able to stand in front of a group of faculty and say, you need to at least get to this level, or you should at least be able to see these things emerging in your students so that you understand there is enough social presence to guide the rest of the learning. Okay. This is a very recent study. Of course, I have a feed that flags me on all the research that is published on the community of inquiry framework in particular. And this study just came out. Very interesting treatment of social presence and teaching presence. And what they identified is that particular students are just as engaged in learning even without critical discourse, reflection, collaboration, and interaction with other students. In fact, I have a master's student who a few years ago now did a study on the solitary learner and interviewed a reasonable portion of women intensely who said, she was looking particularly at women, but she discerned in those women a wish to be a solitary learner and to be less dependent on what other people were doing and have the opportunity to work alone. And that emerges again in what Lambert and Fisher says. So here we get not that social presence is necessary but not sufficient, but that social presence is sufficient, which we know from other studies, but not necessary. One of my big things recently, of course, has been to study emotional presence. And the reason for that is because Lippmann, who was the original writer on communities of inquiry, Garrison and Anderson, of course, did a major translation of that and reconstructed it for online environments. But if you look at what Lippmann and others say, to be socially present is also to be emotionally present. And in fact, the early work from Liam Rourke and Terry Anderson identified 5 indicators of social expression, and 7 of those had to do with the exhibition of emotion. So myself and one of my graduate students looked further into this. We've now constructed and tested via factor analysis in 2 studies, one a smaller study of 70 students, now a much larger study of about 600, that identify that emotional presence, in fact, may even be a separate element in the construction of a community of inquiry, and that as we conceive of social presence, it's acting as a surrogate concept for emotional presence. So we need to consider that as we move on in our research and practice. This is something Randy Garrison, the originator of the online community of inquiry theory, wrote in 2012, last year, and he's beginning to identify that there is much social presence is idiosyncratic. And I think the other thing that we talk about more now when we talk about the community of inquiry is the notion that often social presence is considered relative to the individual. Jennifer said very nicely that we need to look more at the environment. That studies are emerging more about the environments that surround social presence, and that what's most important in social presence is not just what's happening to the individual, but in fact how the individual is interpreting the presence of others, which is also a critical social issue. Randy's new definition of social presence is the ability of participants to identify with the group or course of study, communicate purposefully in a trusting environment, and develop personal and affective relationships progressively by way of projecting their individual personalities. So we have some good definitions as a foundation. Now the definitions are expanding to engage the complexity. We will, based on this, with the support of this research grant that we've just received, be able to not only do an analysis of the 1,000+ articles that have cited the work. Now, only some of those will be research articles, thank goodness, but we will have many to categorize. Some will be quantitative articles that we can do a meta-analysis with. Others will have to be synthesized in different ways. What we also want to do with that information is contact those researchers to engage them in a further discussion. What's happened since they've done this research? What else are they working on? What have they found? So I want to tell you that we will be launching a new website on the community of inquiry, one that offers opportunity for interaction and will be somewhat of a repository. Depending on resources, of course, we will build it as a repository and endeavor to keep it current with as a place where you can look for information about the community of inquiry, and I hope we'll be able to extend it on to research on individual presences, whether they include the community of inquiry or not. So thank you all very much for being here. I want to thank my co-presenters as well for agreeing to do this four-sider in June, where sometimes it's difficult for us to get presenters. And I would like now to leave the mic and give the last word to our participants to allow them to make any comment or ask any questions.
Okay, and yes, I would like to pass along my thank yous as well. Thank you to all four of our presenters today, and for pushing through despite our small but very loyal audience. Thank you to our participants for joining us. And yes, I do have, I will be posting your Community of Inquiry link on our website shortly. One question I do have to begin the Q&A is originally this was billed as measurement of social presence. We've dropped the measurement from the title, but I'm wondering, are there specific things you'd like to say about the potential conflict between measurement and the notion of individual personalities, the difficulty of measuring something that is so individual?
I went ahead and grabbed the mic first. What I will say is, this goes back to Marty's great Google alerts on social presence. This was really picked up from originally a paper that I wrote that's in press on the measurement. And Marty saw it and then was like, let's debate it with the women of social presence. And I think I cried a little thinking about that. But I think that sometimes when we think of measurement, it depends how you think of it. And so one of the studies I've done where we actually surveyed and then did follow-up interviews, some of that difference came out, right? And so what we found was, and it's kind of been brought up already, is that, well, it just depends. Some people who rated social presence really high when we interview, or really low that is, using the Community of Inquiry questionnaire survey, when we actually interviewed them and they talked more about it, it was clear that, well, no, it's not that they didn't value social presence, but what came up about that, among other things, was that there is a lot of difference, and that there is, at least in the little work that I've done, is that, and this goes back to, I think, subject matter differences, personality differences, lots of different things, but that people do have their own social presence needs, and I think that complicates things. With that said, I think there's still more work to find out. Is there a baseline that a certain amount that most people need? I don't know, but you're right. It's very complicated to measure. And the paper that I originally wrote, and I could share, was just basically me whining about my own difficulties measuring social presence that eventually came to a head with my dissertation. So I will, with that, release the mic.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that was a tricky question to throw in right there at the end, but hopefully it gets the ball started. We actually are over time now, so hopefully we can get through this very quickly. We don't want to hold our guests really any longer than they have to be here. So if there are any questions, grab the mic, and then hopefully we can wrap things up in a minute or two.
I will acknowledge, Barbie, there's a comment about does social presence depend on level of social ties? And I would have her kind of elaborate on it, but what some of the research definitely suggests is it does depend on whether you're going to have a prolonged relationship with someone, and that's what other research as well as my own has shown, is that if people know that they have to continue to work with someone, like another student, let's say it's a cohort model, they're a lot more invested or interested in building that community with that person, where sometimes, and this was some of the early critiques of Shorten, their research was that being experimental in the bipolar scale was that basically people were asked these basic decontextualized questions that didn't make sense and didn't have that history, that relationship. So All right, so I think Karen's got to go. We're out of time, but I know for me this was a pleasure. Feel free to email me or any of us. We'd love to continue this conversation elsewhere.
Okay, and yes, thank you again. So yeah, we'll wrap things up, and if there are further questions, you can contact our presenters. And once again, thank you very much for coming. And this recording will be available on our website, cider.athabascau.ca, very shortly. So you can replay it and be sure to pass it around because not enough people have heard it yet. So yes, and if anyone knows of anyone who would like to present in our 2013-14 season, please contact Dr. Terry Anderson, Terry A at athabascau.ca. And yeah, we're off until September. So please return in September for our new season. Thanks and goodbye.